On August 9th, and this would have been 2010, so about 11 months after Mitrice had been missing, um, I got a text message from someone from the Los Angeles County REACT team, who in the message it said partially mummified skeletal remains found in the canyons of Malibu, and this individual believed that it was not too far from the place where Mitrice was last seen at Bill Smith's house.
The family of Mitrice Richardson, I'm sorry. The family of Mitrice Richardson is who we were helping assist.
Do they know you're here today?
They do know I'm here today, yes. I contacted them when I heard about it, and they're on their way as well.
They're on their way out here?
Yes.
What are their thoughts about this discovery today?
They're very disturbed. They're hoping that it's not her, but then again, they're kind of scared that it is her.
It's been 11 months. They've been coming out to a lot of locations,
Yes,
including a recent possible sighting in Vegas.
Yes, ma'am.
This has got to be kind of
It's
heart-tugging for
very,
you.
Every time we go out with the family, it's difficult, you know. Because they're on that last edge of hope, you know, and just coming out with them. It's starting to get to me too, you know, because it's, you know, it's starting to get to me.
To my recollection, it was after lunch, so somewhere between 12:45, 1 o'clock, something like that, right? And I say that because I literally was having lunch with my husband when I got the text message.
Mm-hmm.
I made a phone call to Mitrice's mother. I made a phone call to Mitrice's aunt, and letting them know this is what I just received, and we needed to make a decision of what we were going to do. Our source was pretty reliable. He had helped us on previous searches for Mitrice, and he was very well connected with the sheriffs as well as the rangers. So that message that he received came across, you know, a message board. Mitrice's aunt then called the lead detective in the case, which was Lieutenant Rawson at the time, and relayed to him what it was I had shared with her. And he really downplayed it and said, no, it was just a couple of bones. There's nothing, you know, there's nothing to worry about. It was just a couple of bones. And I was like, no, this person read this to me. This is more than just a couple of bones. So then we decided that we were going to have to, you know, get down there. I want to say we made it out there at about the 3 o'clock hour. And by the time that we arrived, myself, several other supporters, and it was fully staged with law enforcement, the area where we went. We knew we were going to the area that was the entrance of the creek bed and near the property of off of Payuma. So we knew that that's where we were going. And so when we got there, the media was already there. It was just like a circus. And so for them to tell us there were just a few remains, and then we arrive on the scene, then there's all of this, then we knew that there was, you know, something pretty suspicious going on.
So I watched the video that you sent me earlier today, a couple videos actually, and I could see Whitmore talking to the reporter on the video. And here he's saying that they needed to be helicoptered in. And I'm like, and it took the Rangers or whoever went, like, we're doing the eradication or doing whatever hike they needed to do to see if any more grows had taken place, right? So he's telling the reporter that it took 4 hours to hike there. And I'm like, that is such bullshit. It's so not true.
Could you describe how these bones may have gotten there? Is there like a trail nearby?
No, there's no trail
really
nearby.
Like totally removed from...
Totally remote.
Yeah.
It's, as I said, this morning when the park rangers set out to look at the marijuana grows that were active a couple of seasons ago to see if they were active this growing season. It took them 3 to 4 hours to get there, just to get to the grow, and that's when they discovered the bones. We couldn't even go in by foot. We had to chop her in and then lower down.
And then you were describing.
And then, by the way, we were not close. We then had to hike up. They had to hike up to where it was.
Well, so what had happened is there was a big marijuana grow in that area, which already tells you that it's not that remote. So if marijuana
Really?
growers can get all of their equipment there to, to cultivate the marijuana, then it is somewhat accessible. So they were coming back to make sure that the eradication that they had done in the previous year, they had come back to make sure that grow was, that they hadn't kind of reestablished themselves. If it took them 4 hours to get there, that, maybe because along the way they weren't just hiking straight in. Maybe,
That's what I
they
was
got to do a job.
thinking. I'm thinking if it took those
Yeah.
guys 4 hours, that means they had a lot of other areas that they needed to survey, during that time. But Whitmore was saying that they needed to be helicoptered in. I'm like, why? You could drive up right up Malibu Canyon, make a left on Piuma, and go right around the corner. And you guys had hiked in. So that also proves, you told me that it took only an hour for you guys to hike in, correct? And you guys are not experienced hikers.
It took us, so this would have been after, honestly, this would have been after her remains had already been discovered.
Right.
We wanted to go and, place a memorial at the site of her remains. And we had to fight for that, by the way. They did not want, they meaning the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, did not want to give us the location of her remains. So we had to call a meeting with Lee Baca at the time. And we explained to him what we wanted to do. And he ordered that they not only give us the coordinates, but that they also have the search and rescue team hike us in. So led by Tui Wright, sometime after her body was discovered, we were hiked in. I would say it took us a little bit over an hour to hike in. And we did have to have, we were kind of garbed up, and that was just more to protect us from the poison oak. There were places in the way that they took us that we did need to be harnessed in to kind of like, like be propelled
Drop down
over,
a little.
repelled up rock, up boulders. A moderately skilled hiker would not have needed that equipment, and they just needed to give us that equipment because we were, for safety.
You guys
so
were
I wouldn't say
basically under their care, so to speak.
Right. So it definitely is not like a leisurely hike. I believe that most people who are averagely fit would be able to make it in more than, an hour and a half. Quite frankly, we were motivated, right? So we didn't really need much of a break, but there were a couple times I remember where Tui, right, actually did need a break. And so we kind of had to stop and wait for him to have his little break. So it took us a little over an hour to get there, but it definitely was not.
The reason why I'm even bringing this up is because they are trying to make it so basically the discrepancy is already there with Whitmore and what he said. Okay, that this is a super remote area. There's, we can't let anybody in there, that kind of, and I know because I've been in the area myself for a very long time. I know these hikes, I know the mountains. And so I guess there was such a huge discrepancy with him saying, oh, it took them 4 hours to get there and we had to be helicoptered in. It seems like the excuses were already mounting, and which is interesting because it was even before the homicide detectives had made the decision to remove the remains. You see what I'm saying?
We don't really know when they made the decisions to remove those remains.
Well,
by the time,
when Whitmore was there, didn't he just get there? Didn't they just kind of, it was only a couple hours after, right?
So when Whitmer was definitely there when we arrived, and that was somewhere around the 3 o'clock hour, that was already 2 hours worth of time where the coroners, I don't even know at that point, had the coroners been alerted at that point, because they were
alerted at like 1 p.m. something like that, 12 to 1 p.m. if I remember correctly.
No, so it was like this. Somewhere they claim that somewhere around the 1 o'clock hour, the Rangers just found her body. This is what they're claiming, or
Right,
found remains. They're not saying that they were hers.
right.
Around 1:30, Tui Wright from the Malibu Search and Rescue was at the site. We don't know how he got from the Lost Hill station to that site in a half an hour, but he declared her dead at about 1:30.
So
The coroners were
he
not.
actually made the formal declaration that the remains that he found were dead. He made a formal declaration that
That there were skeletal remains and that a
yes,
death had occurred, and this was
yeah,
approximately 1:30.
right.
So that's already a half an hour. My recollection is that the coroners were not alerted until about 3:30. So there was about 2.5 hours, 2 to 2.5 hours in there where the Rangers were there, Tui Wright was there, and some of the LASD personnel were already there for a significant amount of time before the coroners were even alerted at all. So what happened in that time, I cannot imagine, but certainly and maybe maybe some of them were helicoptered in. I directly spoke with Tui Wright about how he got there. He claims to me that he hiked in through the creek bed. So lots of discrepancies, because they are telling you that this is difficult to get to, so much so that it took the Rangers 4 hours to get there. Tui Wright is claiming to me that he somehow made it from the station to the creek bed in a half an hour to declare those remains, that those were human remains. So there's lots of controversy, lots of conflicts, lots of confusion about whether this place was remote or not. And a reasonable person would assume that it wasn't so remote, since it was the location of a pretty extensive marijuana grow.
Yeah, as well as Mitrice having to make her way there to that area, to
So
die
and the
that
question
area.
Right. So the question is, how did she get there? That certainly becomes confusing, because, if unless you're from that area, when you're looking, sort of up Piuma, you wouldn't realize that that was the entrance of a creek bed. You can kind of see the entrance of what ultimately we found out was the property of, a large porn ranch. But even looking at that, you wouldn't know that that was there, because it's kind of, I think it's like a mile and a half in or something like that to get to the actual residence. The average person who's not from that area is not going to have any clue about what they're looking at when you're kind of staring up Piuma Road. So to imagine that Mitrice would have, in the middle of the night, walked up a creek bed at night and got herself there, I could not imagine.
It's a
how that
complete
could have occurred.
impossibility. It's a complete impossibility, as somebody who's lived in this area for over 20 years, who's done many hikes in many areas of the Santa Monica Mountains, seeing how remote that area was where her remains were found, and for her to make it there in the dark on her own, hell no.
But I can, if we consider this, if we considered that maybe somehow she was last seen in Bill Smith's backyard somewhere, although the time is somewhere between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., depending on who you talk to. So at some point it would have been light. So even if I could consider that maybe it in the light of the day, she walked up the road and no one saw her, and she somehow managed to find the entrance to this creek bed, which is kind of indescript, but let's say that she did. And let's say that even she did what she was compromised mentally. Let's say that she was able to make her way up through the creek bed and end up where she was, even, taking in consideration that she has asthma and she uses an inhaler. Yeah, I don't know how she would have done that, but let's just say she did. And let's just say that she did lay down, take off her clothes and lay down and die. Let's just consider that, right? Hang on. So even if we consider that, this is a location that is known to the Malibu Search and Rescue Team. So that when you have an individual who has gone missing, and you know that people are searching for them, and you know that they were last seen at a residency approximately a little over a mile from the creek bed that you're fully aware of, because by the way, you're part of the search and rescue team. You search for people all the time, and you're also been part of the marijuana eradication team. Why wouldn't that be the first place that you searched? So I'm okay to consider all possibilities, but we do have to follow those things to its logical conclusion. I would have assumed that she would have been found within days of her gone missing, or if not the first day, because that would have been the first place that you would go to look. I've had many conversations with Tui Wright, and he's taught me many things, honestly, about searching. And one of those is individuals are typically found within a 3-mile radius of where they were last seen. And if we take in consideration that she was last seen in Bill Smith's home, then that definitely would have been a place that you would have looked, even if I'm very confused about how she could have made it there. So even that in itself is concerning, even if we assume that she walked up there herself.
So that's a very interesting observation. We've talked about it before, about the 3-mile radius from where she was last found. And we also talked about the fact that every time there was a search, that Tui Wright, who was in charge of those searches, would direct the search away from where she was found. So here he is offering up this information about how you look in a 3-mile radius, and then he's not following what he's telling you on purpose.
Right. And so that's one of the reasons why whenever they would do a search, we would challenge him on that. So the big search that they did supposedly in January, which excluded the Montanito area where she was last seen. It excluded that. Mitrice's mom and I were like, why are we not searching in a 3-mile radius of where she was last seen? We challenged him on that. And he said, ultimately we're going to do that. The question is, why can't we do that now if we know that should be,
that should
protocol?
be the first place he starts looking, within the 3-mile radius, and exhausting everything that they had in terms of resources to search in those areas. And
also we were not aware that there was a creek bed in that area. We had no knowledge of. He obviously knew, but we had no idea that there was a creek bed. We just thought, start there and look in that community, wherever that might take you. But I believe maybe we would have been able to push for more if we knew that there was a creek bed, or been able to explore that ourselves.
So let's talk about the decision to remove the remains against the coroner's direction by LASD homicide detectives Dan McElderry and Kevin Acevedo.
So there's lots of confusion in my mind about what went on actually down there. There was a time that we were told that the Rangers were down there. We know that Tui Wright was down there, and other members of the Malibu search and rescue team. We know that Kevin Acevedo and Dan McElderry, those would have been the detectives who actually removed her remains and placed her remains in the body bag. And we don't know who else was down there in that area, and it's never been described to us and never been provided to us. We do know that the coroners were not there, and we do know that 6.5. They were down there, meaning meaning LASD was down. They basically had control of her remains for over 6 hours, without any input from the coroners, without any coroner down there looking at the scene or looking at their remains or assisting in making a decision, on-site decision of what was going on. They were held at bay. The coroners ultimately were given coordinates, but they were dropped into the wrong coordinates, right? So then they were actually taken back to the Lost Hill station. So we're looking at 6.5 hours of LASD being at that creek bed with remains that they are telling us that they have no idea if it's male or female, no idea who this individual is. Yet the only detectives that were down at the site of that creek bed were the detectives that were involved in Mitrice's case. And there were other people who have gone missing. So why were those detectives called to be at the creek bed? And why were they the ones who decided to remove her body? And why did they, if anybody had to be airlifted in there, why would it be the detectives as opposed to immediately being in the coroners? And why did 6.5 hours go by before the coroners were even able to look at her remains, and even that was back at the Lost Hill station. Let me just backtrack a tiny bit though. So, because what we were told ultimately or eventually is that there was some discussion about removing her remains. Ed Winters, out of his own mouth, told me it wasn't there should not have had to have even been a direct order. They should have known, and they know because they're homicide detectives, not to touch remains unless you're told to. So there was some argument between the LASD and the coroner about the jurisdiction of these remains. That is absolutely ridiculous. These are homicide detectives who they know damn well that the coroner is in charge of any types of remain. So there was some argument about that. But Ed Winters told me himself that he very clearly said, do not touch her remains. Don't do it. And they did it anyway. Supposedly, it was the lead detective, Mike Rawson, who, I don't want to say ordered, but whatever, for lack of a better word, ordered Kevin Acevedo and McElderry to remove her remains. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure because that came out later. But in any case, we do know that Dan McElderry and Kevin Acevedo scooped up her remains, not even all of them, placed them in a body bag. And that included clothing, which were downstream, down, the creek bed. So they gathered clothing belonging to whoever and put them in the body bag, as well as hair belonging to whoever, because it wasn't on her head. It just happened to be in the creek bed. And we're talking about 400 feet away. Some of her belongings were 400 feet away. And so they just scooped that, put all of that in the body bag, and that is what they delivered to
With the body.
Lost Hill station.
With the body.
With the body. They had her skull and they put it in a bucket, and they had her.
As homicide detectives, they don't understand how to bag evidence?
It's not their job to collect remains. That is the job. That is not their job. That is not their specialty. That is not what they're trained to do. That is the job of the coroner. And that is why the coroners would have been the ones to come in to make sure that her remains were documented appropriately, that the scene was photo documented appropriately, and that her, her clothing would have then been dealt with properly. But the coroners weren't there, so that didn't happen. So these gentlemen just took it upon themselves to, scoop her up, and then she was airlifted out. And we were there when she was airlifted out. We saw the helicopter airlifting what we at the time assumed was Mitrice. They told us when we were there that they were going to secure the area, and that they were most likely going to remove her in the morning, or because it had to be when the coroners got there. So we were with the understanding that they were just waiting for the coroners to be able to get there. At some point, we did learn that the coroners were airlifted into the wrong spot, and they were to be, correctly, airlifted to the correct spot. But somehow there was some other accident somewhere, and the helicopter had to go retrieve someone who was stuck on a cliff, so that they were going to have to stay there, overnight, and so they would just have somebody securing her remains. However, in saying that, and they were saying that to get us to leave the scene, and we would not leave. So we stayed for probably hours. And I think ultimately it was just a waiting game. So at some point we saw the helicopter come, and we saw this basket rising out of the canyon, which could have just as easily been them choosing to put the coroners in there and having them at least do the best job that they can while they did have the daylight hours, and then lift the remains of whoever this person was, because they weren't saying that it was Mitrice, with the coroners.
And do you think that the homicide detectives collecting the remains the way they did, do you think that affected the overall outcome of her autopsy?
So, in speaking with Ed Winters, and Alyssa Fleek was the actual investigator on Mitrice's case, and speaking to both of them, they were confused. basically they didn't get to see the scene. They had no idea of of the location, what the location of her body was. They had no idea that it was adjacent to the porn ranch. They had no idea of what the creek bed area looked like. All they did was have the bones that were delivered to them at at the Lost Hill station. So their hands are kind of tied, which is what they shared with us in terms of what they could do. The detectives did take photos, but they did not take those in the way that were helpful to the coroners, and not to mention the fact they were down there for so many hours alone with these remains. No one could really understand what may have gone on down there. Why do you need to be down there for 6.5 hours and you don't even have the expertise of the coroners at the scene, who, by the way, if they couldn't have been airlifted in, they could have hiked in,
Yeah,
because we did.
that's what I'm saying. That's why I brought that up in the beginning, is that it's not this 4-hour journey like Whitmore was trying to tell the reporter. It is a fairly accessible hike, and it does. I mean, even inexperienced people, maybe a little longer than an hour, but around about an hour. Again, very suspicious. Why the actual person who really truly did find these remains has not been identified. Everybody's saying
Yeah,
it was him, it was him, it was him, it was him. And nobody wants to admit responsibility for actually finding the remains. And the only one who wants to admit the responsibility was Tui Wright. And we're hearing that that is
right.
not the case. Correct?
And that's another thing that's confusing, because we heard that there were two rangers. The two rangers are the ones that stumbled upon her body. They never named those rangers, and and none of those rangers have ever come forward and said, yes, this was me. At least they haven't done that. They haven't said that to me, and I've inquired. The only person who admitted to finding her remains, and that would have been Tui Wright, and he told me that he was the one who found her remains. Whether that's
He's
true or not,
also the
I don't know.
one. He is also the one who has sabotaged pretty much every search, including stopping canines that picked up Mitrice's scent.
Right.
So,
So he definitely was in charge of where the searches occurred, and he definitely was the one who made for whatever reason was not compelled to search the creek bed area when she initially went missing. And he also was along with the detectives and the rangers and whoever else was down there for the many hours that they were down there alone with her remains. He definitely was one of the individuals who was down there. Why when her body was airlifted out, meaning they had like a deputy who was, I don't want to quite say guarding us, but he was definitely making sure that we weren't crossing the line that they had made for us, like we can't go any further than this point. And he was kind of there guarding that area. And so when you see the helicopter removing whatever they were removing, and we assumed that it was Mitrice, then they said, you guys might as well go now. We would not go. We still stayed. And finally they said, listen, we're gonna have a press conference back at the station, so you guys can go now. And we still, for whatever reason, said, okay, we'll go to the press conference, but we still stayed for a little bit longer. And all of a sudden we see all of these official cars driving out of the property on Payumas. They're just, I can't even tell you how many, but I counted 8. There could have been more. And so we just see all of them just driving out. And ultimately we decided to leave when there were no more vehicles, the SUVs and the canines. So when those were all gone, we followed those back to the main to the Lost Hill station. And it was pandemonium. Ed Winters was very angry. Lieutenant Rawson was not happy. They were arguing over, again, jurisdiction. They were arguing over who said what, that they were never given the permission, to do that, to remove her remains. And so there was that kind of arguing going on. But what happened is when the official press conference started, they all kind of aligned themselves, including Ed Winter, and they just kind of made nice, and they just made their statement about, we don't know whose remains these are. There was, in fact, another family member,
Yeah.
the wife of Tim Perriman, she was
Yeah.
there, because
Yeah.
they're saying, we don't know if this was male or female, we don't know the age, we don't know any of this stuff. And so people are coming out who have missing individuals, if and so they did the official press conference, and then they said that was it, and we'll get back to you when we make the determination. We assumed that it was I assumed that it was Mitrice, because it didn't make any sense to me that you would have the lead detective, Ross. And by the way, at the press conference, I never saw Kevin Acevedo, or Dan McElderry. The individuals who actually removed her body, we have no idea where they were.
Very
Mike Rawson.
interesting. Very interesting.
Mike Rawson was the one who was doing all the talking, and it was a wait and see. We will have to figure out if this was male or female, or if the age of the individual. Meanwhile, you pick up clothing, you stick it in the body bag, you have a partially mummified body. You still, have pubic hair. There was still indications that this, at the very least, that this was a female. So this Tim Perriman's mom, why put her through that agony when at the very least it's not a man, right?
Yeah.
And the hair that was throughout the creek bed, he didn't have long, kinky kind of curly hair,
Yeah. Right.
he was a white guy with a very short cut hair. So why put her through that? And for that matter, why assume that those clothing belonged to the individual who was at the creek bed anyway, if they weren't on her? Why assume that was her hair? Why they made that assumption? And I believe everybody made the assumption that it was her, which is why Kevin Acevedo and Dan McElderry and Lieutenant Rawson were there to begin with. At the point that they called and they identified that the remains were Mitrice, they were already set up with the press conference. So Lee Baca was already downtown doing a press conference. And when they, right after they got off the phone with us and confirmed that it was her. And then also sometime we got the coroner's report, and the coroner's report was very clear that we ordered them, that they moved her remains without the, against the orders of the coroner, and that it compromised the scene. We also had a meeting with Ed Winter, who at that point, it was a couple days later, threatened legal action. And he said, even though it was only a misdemeanor, somebody needs to be held responsible for that. I didn't even know it was a misdemeanor, but, and that he was going to push for that. He did tell us, though, at the press conference on the day that her body was found, he felt very uncomfortable, with, standing up there with the LASD, but he was ordered to do that. Like, you guys have to, you have to do this press conferences, and he wasn't allowed to, at that point, make any comments about, his disagreement with LASD. Let's just do this press conference and get it over. So at some point, though, although he told us that he was going to go forward with legal action, he never did. And I think I can understand why, because ultimately there was so much mismanagement in Mitrice's case with regards to the LASD, but there was also mismanagement on the part of the coroners. And we know that because we had an independent examination done of Mitrice's body, and from a person who was a forensic anthropologist. And what she shared with us is that when she opened Mitrice's body bag, Mitrice's clothing was still in the body bag, which meant the LASD and the coroners, they never took her remains to the crime lab. And this evaluation that occurred from our forensic anthropologist happened on the day of Mitrice's funeral. So had we not had someone available to open up her body bag and to look, we wouldn't have any idea that, number one, the clothing was in there and never went to the crime lab. But then also there was not any type of real forensic evaluation done on Mitrice's remains on the part of the coroners. What our forensic anthropologist told us, and she called me because she was doing the examination while we were preparing for the funeral on the day of the funeral. And she called me and she said, Rhonda, there has been no evaluation of her body. And she was explaining to me why, that what happens when you do a complete evaluation, you know, the bones are cleaned and all these different things. And this wasn't done. There were artifacts in Mitrice's hair. There was an earring in her hair, in the hair that I guess they presumed belonged to Mitrice, because it wasn't attached to her hair. It was just the hair that they put in the body bag. So there was jewelry. There was, you know, bones that weren't clean. She said there was clear that there was no, on the part of the coroner, evaluation done of Mitrice. And that we learned subsequently that ultimately Mitrice was, it was determined that it was Mitrice through dental. The odontologist looked at her teeth and made the determination that that was Mitrice. And so we had to, you know, on that day we continued on with the funeral, and which is why we ultimately had to fight for an exhumation to have her properly, you know, evaluated. So, you know, Ed Winter going from, I want to, you know, file charges against these guys for this illegal action and compromising this, you know, crime or the scene, by removing her body against my orders, from him going like he wanted to eat legal actions to, oh, there was just miscommunication. That's only based on the fact that they all had to cover their asses, because the coroners also did not do their job. And rather the LASD made it difficult for them to do it or not, they still didn't do it. Nobody cared about where those clothing were. Nobody cared about things going to the crime lab. The coroners didn't care about doing a proper evaluation. You know, this was all about ego, that the coroners was so upset that the LASD took this action against their orders, that they're more fighting about that instead of anybody actually worried about what's going on, you know, with this individual who you claim that you don't know who they are yet. I can also share about on that, you know, sometime after, maybe a day or two after the funeral, we began to devise a plan to meet with the coroners. The head of the medical examiners team there, and as well as Alyssa Fleek, who would have been the investigator, and the entire, you know, all the scientists, if you want to call them, who were involved in examining her body. We had a meeting, and we had to justify why we believed that there needed to be, you know, an exhumation. Because that is not something that happens. And part of the, you know, our forensic anthropologist was there and said, because you guys didn't even x-ray her hair to find the artifacts that I found with my eyeballs, because there was, you know, there were just, her body was not examined. During that meeting, and it wasn't that long, because they knew that they were going to have to, you know, they knew that they were going to have to exhume her body. But during that meeting, I was sitting right next to Alyssa Fleek, and we were having a private conversation. She was explaining to me that she had, when they eventually went to the remains, because a couple days later they were actually able to go to the site and they recovered additional remains. Additional remains obviously are going to happen when you have inexperienced and not unqualified individuals moving a body. She was explaining to me where those remains were, and I was like, that is not where we were taken, because by then we had been hiked into the site of where her remains were. So I knew where it hiked in by Tui, right? So I knew where her remains were, part of them anyways. And so what she was describing to me was a different location. And I was like, it's in the same general area, but Mitrice was in a gully. And what Investigator Fleek was describing to me was like a mound. And I was like, I know where that mound was that she was talking about, because when Tui Wright walked us into the creek bed under the orders of Lee Baca, there was crime tape around that mound. So a reasonable person would have just walked to that mound and assumed that that's where Mitrice's body was found, right? So when we walked in, the rest of the search team walked in that direction, but Tui walked to the creek, the little gully. So I followed Tui, and I said, why are you here? But they're there. And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, isn't that where her body was found? And he said, no, her body was found here. And I know that because I found her body. And I said, well, then I thought the Rangers found her body. And then we just kind of had a moment of staring at each other, and that was kind of it. And he eventually called the other team to come over to the gully area, that this is where her body was actually found. And it was during that, where we were memorializing her, that the forensic anthropologist who was volunteering, she was showing me how they actually search for extra bones when you haven't retrieved the entire body. And in doing that, I unearthed a finger bone of Mitrice, or of somebody who ultimately we found out was Mitrice. And then at that point, they stopped us and they airlifted us out of there. So what as I'm talking, so I'm sharing that with the investigator, but she's sure, no, we found bones on this mound. And it looks like what was going on is there was some bones that were in the gully, but there were also bones that were on this mound. And so then that point, the investigators had to go back in and even, retrieve even more bones. And this is what happens when you have people who are not qualified to, search the area and make proper determinations and photo document things.